My sister tapped the serving spoon with one manicured finger and told the whole table I hadn't paid a penny toward my own mother's birthday dinner. She didn't lower her voice to do it. She wanted people to hear. "Don't fill your plate, Liv," Diane said, smiling the way she smiles when she already thinks she's won something. "You didn't contribute a penny to this dinner." 12 people stopped eating. I actually watched it happen, fork by fork, down both sides of the table, like a wave losing its nerve. My cousin froze with a piece of bread halfway to his mouth. My aunt suddenly found her napkin fascinating. And my mother, sitting 2 seats away in the birthday chair I'd picked out for her myself, smiled into her wine glass like Diane had made a joke instead of an accusation. "Diane is only teasing," Mom said. Then, to the table, warmly, like she was smoothing a wrinkle out of a tablecloth. "Real family comes first. We should be grateful to the people who actually showed up for me." I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because I had to sit with it a lot longer than a second. At that table, in that dress, holding a spoon I'd been told I hadn't earned the right to touch. Here is what nobody at that table knew. I had signed the contract with the venue 3 weeks earlier. I had placed the $2,000 deposit on my own card. I had approved the menu, chosen the wine my mother actually likes instead of the one Diane decided she liked, hired the car service for my grandparents, and picked out the blue and silver cake, because those are my mother's favorite colors, and have been since I was a little girl watching her set the table in blue and silver every Christmas. I had done every single thing that made that dinner exist, and I had done it quietly on purpose, because I wanted the night to feel like a gift and not a performance. Diane had done none of it. Diane had done something else entirely, and I didn't fully understand what until about 90 minutes later, when a man in a dark blazer walked back into that dining room carrying a leather folio, and every face at that table went the color of the tablecloth. But we're not there yet. First, I need you to understand 3 things, because if you don't, none of what happens next will make any sense. I need you to understand why I paid for that dinner, without telling anyone the amount. I need you to understand why, when my own sister humiliated me in front of people I've known my whole life, I didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't reach into my purse and lay the contract on the table like a winning hand. And I need you to understand why the person who should have defended me, my mother, sitting closer to me than anyone else at that table, chose, instead, to smile. Because I did have an answer to all 3. I'd had it for years. I just hadn't been ready to use it until that exact moment, with a serving spoon in my hand and my sister's finger still hovering over it like she owned the whole table and everyone sitting at it. I set the spoon down. "You're right," I said. Diane blinked. She had been braced for an argument, and an argument was the one thing I decided, right there, I was never going to give her again. "I shouldn't eat food I didn't contribute to," I said, and I watched something flicker across her face, not quite doubt, but its early cousin, the first hint that she might have miscalculated. My mother laughed softly, relieved, the way you laugh when you think a difficult moment has resolved itself in your favor. It hadn't, it was only getting started. I folded my napkin. I set it beside my plate the way I'd been taught to as a girl, corners matching. I stood up. "Don't be dramatic," Diane said, that same finger still resting near the spoon like a queen's scepter. "I'm not being dramatic," I said. "I'm correcting the arrangement." I put on my red coat, the one that matched the dress I'd worn on purpose that night, because some part of me, even before Diane opened her mouth, had known I might need to be easy to spot from across a room, and I walked toward the lobby. Nobody got up. Nobody called my name. 12 people who had eaten off plates I paid for watched me leave and did nothing, and I want to tell you that hurt worse than anything Diane said, but it also made the next 10 minutes considerably easier. Because in the lobby, there was a man named Marcus, standing behind a reception desk with a tablet in his hand, and I was about to ask him for something that would make sure my family never mistook my silence for weakness again. Before I tell you what was inside that folio, I want to ask you for something small. If a story like this one, about being underestimated by the people who were supposed to know better, is the kind of thing that keeps you listening past midnight, hit subscribe to Revenge Lab. This channel exists for people like us, the ones who stayed quiet for far too long and are finally ready to hear how it ends. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm 28 years old, and up until that night, I was the kind of person who believed that if I was generous enough, careful enough, and quiet enough about my own contributions, my family would eventually notice on their own and love me the way they loved my sister without my ever having to ask. I want to tell you that theory took one dinner to die. It actually took 12 years, and that night was just the funeral. I work as an architect at a mid-sized firm in the city, and 6 weeks before that dinner, I'd been promoted to project lead on a mixed-use development downtown, the kind of promotion that comes with a raise substantial enough that, for the first time in my adult life, 4 figures on a birthday gift didn't feel like a stretch. I'm good at my job. I'm good, generally, at building things that hold up under weight nobody can see from the outside, a skill, it turns out, that applies to more than buildings. I'm not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you because you need to understand that the woman sitting at that table wasn't naive, and she wasn't poor, and she wasn't someone who couldn't afford to be angry. I had the money, the paperwork, and every legal right to stand up at that table and list every dollar I'd spent. I chose not to for exactly as long as I chose not to, and then I stopped choosing that. Diane is 31, 3 years older than me, and for as long as I can remember, she has been the sun our family orbits. Not because she's cruel, I want to be honest about that from the start, because it would be easy to make her sound like a cartoon, and she isn't one. Diane is smart. She's funny in a room full of strangers in a way I've never quite managed. She remembers people's birthdays and shows up to hospital visits with the right kind of flowers. She is, in almost every situation, the most impressive person in it. She is also someone who has never once, in my entire life, been able to stand next to me without needing to be standing slightly in front of me. I didn't understand that as a pattern until I was much older. As a kid, I just understood it as the weather. Diane got the solo at the recital because she asked first. Diane got to pick the restaurant because she cared more. Diane's opinion carried more weight at dinner because she said things with more confidence, even when, especially when, I was the one who actually knew what I was talking about. I used to think if I just worked hard enough, quietly enough, eventually the scales would even out on their own. I want to tell you exactly how wrong that theory was, and I want to do it with 3 memories, because these are the 3 that were sitting in the back of my mind that whole dinner, long before Diane ever touched that spoon. The first is from when I was 16. Our grandparents were celebrating 50 years of marriage, and I spent 6 weeks designing the program for the anniversary party. The layout, the timeline, a little history of their life together that I'd interviewed them both for separately so I could get the details right. I was proud of that program in the specific, unguarded way you're only proud of things before the world teaches you to hide it. At the party, my aunt complimented it, and before I could say thank you, Diane, standing right beside me, said, "I'm so glad it came together. I was up until 2 in the morning finishing it." She hadn't touched it. She hadn't even seen a draft. The second is from my college graduation. Diane gave a toast at the little family dinner afterward about how she'd guided me through school, about the late-night phone calls, the pep talks, the way she'd never once let me give up. We had barely spoken that entire year. I remember sitting there with a small, tight smile on my face while relatives dabbed their eyes, thinking, I don't remember any of those calls, and neither does she, because they didn't happen. The third isn't really one memory. It's a pattern of them. Every single time I tried to correct the record, gently, in private, my mother told me I was being sensitive. And every single time I stayed quiet instead, Diane treated my silence as permission to say it again, a little louder, a little more publicly, the next time. So here's the honest, unflattering answer to the question of why I kept paying, kept organizing, kept quietly funding things I never got credit for. I wasn't doing it for Diane, and I wasn't really doing it for the extended family either. I was doing it because some stubborn, 12-year-old part of me still believed that if I just gave enough, my mother would eventually look at me the way she looked at Diane, like I was simply, uncomplicatedly hers, without a comparison, standing next to me the whole time. I want to tell you I grew out of that hope before the birthday dinner. I didn't. I grew out of it during it. 3 weeks before that night, my mother called to say she wanted one simple dinner for her 60th birthday. In our family, simple never once stayed simple. I should have known that going in. I didn't, not because I was foolish, but because some part of me, even at 28, was still hoping this might finally be the one time it did. I should tell you about Sophie Harmon here, because she comes up more than once in this story, and I don't want her appearing later like a convenient prop with no history behind her. Sophie is a structural engineer 2 offices down from mine at the firm, the kind of friend you make in your 20s by accident, over shared bad coffee and worse deadlines, and then keep for the rest of your life on purpose. We'd been having lunch together most weekdays for 4 years by the time any of this happened, and over those 4 years, I'd told her more versions of the Diane story than I'd ever fully admitted to myself I was telling. Sophie had opinions about my family long before she ever met most of them in person. "You tell these stories like they're funny," she said to me once, a year or so before the birthday dinner, after I'd relayed some minor incident, Diane taking credit for a gift idea that had actually been mine. "They're not funny, Liv. You just tell them that way so I won't ask you the obvious follow-up question." "What follow-up question?" I asked her. "Why you keep letting it happen?" I didn't have a good answer for her then. I'm not sure I had a complete one even by the night of the dinner. But I want you to know Sophie was already there, in the background of my life, watching this pattern with a clearer eye than I was willing to use on it myself, long before any of what follows ever started. My mother's name is Margaret. My father's name is Walter. When Mom called about the dinner, Dad was the one who actually had the good idea, a private dining room at Cypress Point Inn, a coastal hotel where he and Mom had celebrated their anniversary years before, back when the wallpaper in the lobby was different and neither of them had gray hair yet. Diane announced in the family group chat, within about 4 minutes of Dad mentioning the venue, that she would handle the vision. That's the phrase she used, handle the vision. Then she went quiet every single time the hotel actually needed something from a human being with a checkbook, a deposit, a guest count, a signed agreement, a dietary restriction list. I had just gotten that promotion. I decided on my own, without announcing it to anyone, that I'd cover the dinner as my gift to Mom. I didn't tell the family the amount. I told Diane only that the reservation was secured, and I asked her to send me any dietary restrictions by Friday. She sent back a thumbs up. Then, 40 minutes later, she posted in the group chat, "Everything is taken care of. Mom deserves the best." The relatives thanked her. My mother sent 3 heart emojis in a row. I sat there looking at my phone longer than I should have, feeling the same specific ache I'd felt at 16 watching Diane take credit for a program she never saw, wondering, honestly, why it still had the power to hurt after 12 years of practice. I wish I had a better answer than the one I actually have. The truth is I still wanted my mother to look at me with the same uncomplicated pride she gave Diane without effort. I wanted one evening where nobody compared us. I signed the contract anyway. I paid the $2,000 non-refundable deposit. I authorized my card for the estimated balance. The original package, the one I'd actually agreed to, came to just under $8,000, which already felt like a significant, deliberate gift. Then Diane started making changes. She added a premium wine pairing, a seafood tower, custom floral arrangements that hadn't been in the original quote. 6 guests I had never met in my life, family friends of hers I assume, though I never actually found out. Every time the event coordinator, a calm, unflappable man named Marcus, copied me on an email about one of these additions, Diane beat me to the reply. "Approved," she'd write. "Claire knows." Claire did not know. I called Marcus directly and made it clear politely, but clearly that no additional charge could be finalized without my written consent. Not a phone call, not a group chat thumbs up. Mine, in writing. Marcus apologized for the confusion and flagged the file. I went back and approved exactly one of Diane's additions, the flowers, because I did want the room to look beautiful for my mother, and rejected the rest. Diane called me 2 days later. "Why are you making this difficult?" she said, before I'd even finished saying hello. "Mom only turned 60 once." "You're welcome to pay for the upgrades yourself," I told her. She laughed. It wasn't a mean laugh, exactly. It was worse than mean, it was genuinely amused, the laugh of someone who found the idea of paying for something herself so obviously beside the point that my even suggesting it struck her as funny. "You always make money so awkward," she said. I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count in the months since. It told me everything I needed to know about what was actually happening, if I'd been willing to hear it at the time. Diane wanted the authority of hosting the party, the compliments, the credit, the warm glow of being the daughter who did this for Mom, without carrying a single dollar of the cost that made it real. And she genuinely, sincerely believed that my pointing this out was the awkward part, not the request, my noticing the request. I kept the reservation anyway. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters more than anything else I can tell you about who I was before that night. It wasn't naivety. I knew, by then, exactly what Diane was doing. I kept going because some stubborn, hopeful part of me still believed I could give my mother one clean, uncomplicated evening, that if I just executed everything perfectly enough, quietly enough, the night itself might finally be untouchable, even if the family around it wasn't. I chose blue and silver for the cake because those are Mom's favorite colors. I put together a short slideshow of old family photos, some of them from before I was even born, photos Mom hadn't seen in years, that I'd found by scanning through boxes in her own closet on a Sunday afternoon she thought I was just visiting for. I arranged a car service for my grandparents because my grandfather doesn't like driving at night anymore and would never say so out loud. I even called Marcus one more time before the party. "I don't want a speech about me," I told him. "This is for my mother. If anyone asks who arranged it, just say the family did." He said he understood. I believed, saying that sentence, that I was being generous. I understand now that I was also being erased, and I had just handed Diane the exact instructions for how to do it. The night of the party, I arrived early in a red dress with a matching coat because I wanted to see the room before anyone else did, to make sure the flowers were right, the lighting was right, the cake was displayed the way I'd asked. Marcus met me at the private dining room door with a printed sheet. "Final estimate before service," he said. $9,400, including tax, gratuity, and the floral arrangement you approved. Your card will be charged after dessert per the authorization on file. I signed the updated authorization. I slipped my copy into my purse, next to the folded contract I'd been carrying with me all week without quite admitting to myself why. The room looked exactly the way I'd pictured it back when I was sketching table layouts on a legal pad at my own kitchen counter. Blue and silver runners down the center of each table, low arrangements of white ranunculus so nobody's sightline got blocked. A slideshow loop already queued up on the screen near the window, waiting for the moment after the main course when I'd planned to let it run quietly in the background while people talked. My grandparents arrived not long after I did. My grandfather in the good gray suit he wears maybe twice a year, my grandmother, gone 3 years now, though I think of her every time I see that suit, would have loved the flowers. And I remember thinking, watching Arthur settle carefully into his chair, that at least I'd gotten the car service right. At least he hadn't had to drive himself in the dark the way he hates to anymore. "You did good, kid," he told me quietly, squeezing my hand once before letting go, and I held onto that sentence longer than I probably should have, because it was the only unprompted compliment I received all evening that had nothing to do with anyone needing something from me first. Diane arrived 20 minutes later, in white, which I noticed and didn't say anything about, because I'd learned a long time ago that pointing out Diane's choices only ever gave her a stage to defend them on. She kissed Mom on both cheeks, loudly enough for the room to register the gesture, and immediately began directing the photographer as though she'd hired him herself. She moved 2 place cards. She told the florist the centerpieces were a little low. They were exactly the height I'd specified, because I didn't want anything blocking sightlines across the table. She told 2 separate relatives within my hearing that she had worked tirelessly to put the evening together. I heard every word of it. I said nothing. Part of me was still saving the truth for a moment I hadn't fully decided on yet. Another part of me, the part I'm less proud of, looking back, was still trying to protect my mother's birthday from becoming a battlefield, as if a battlefield weren't exactly what Diane had already turned it into the moment she opened her mouth about the vision 3 weeks earlier. At dinner, Diane took the seat directly beside Mom. She'd moved my place card to the far end of the table, near my cousin's teenage kids, who were perfectly nice, but not exactly who Marcus had planned for the host seat. I found my original card, the one Marcus had assigned me, at the head, opposite my mother, and quietly moved it back. Diane raised one eyebrow at me across the table. "That's for whoever organized this," she said. I met her eyes. Are you sure you want to make that the rule? She smiled because she thought I was bluffing. I sat down anyway. For the first course, she talked over me every time I opened my mouth, redirecting the conversation back to herself with the easy confidence of someone who has never once worried about being interrupted in turn. During the second course, she accepted compliments about the venue, the lighting, the room, the flowers, with a small, modest smile, as though she were too gracious to take full credit, which of course made her seem even more gracious for not taking it, which of course meant she got the credit anyway. By the time the main course arrived, she had rewritten the entire evening with herself at its center. And my mother, without seeming to notice she was doing it, was helping her do it, laughing at the right moments, touching Diane's arm, glowing in the specific way mothers glow when they believe their child has done something remarkable for them. "Diane, this room is stunning," my aunt said, leaning across the table. "However did you manage the flowers on top of everything else?" "Oh, it wasn't easy," Diane said, with the small, self-deprecating laugh she uses when she wants a compliment to sound like a burden she carried gracefully. "I wanted it to look effortless for Mom. That's really all that mattered to me." I watched my mother beam at that answer like it confirmed something she'd always believed about her older daughter. And I felt the particular, specific loneliness of sitting 2 seats away from your own family while they applaud a story about you that doesn't include you at all. I sat there in the seat that was supposed to be mine, in a dress the color of a stop sign, watching my own gift get quietly handed to someone else, one compliment at a time. Then I reached for the serving spoon. Diane decided, in that exact moment, that taking credit wasn't enough anymore. She needed to humiliate me too. "I've already told you what happened next, the spoon, the finger, the sentence that stopped 12 forks in midair. I've told you what my mother said. I've told you that I set the spoon down, agreed with Diane out loud, folded my napkin, and walked out in my red coat while nobody followed me. What I haven't told you is what happened in the 60 seconds between the insult and my standing up, because that's the part that actually decided everything that came after." Diane laughed before Mom could even respond to my question. I'd asked, quietly, "Who do you believe paid for tonight?" Anne said, "Please, you probably booked the room with Dad's hotel points and expect a parade." A cousin lowered his eyes to his plate. My aunt suddenly needed to adjust her napkin. My father studied the label on the wine bottle like it contained an exit he hadn't found yet. I could have opened my purse right there. I had the contract folded inside it, the deposit receipt, the final estimate with my signature on it from 20 minutes earlier. I could have laid it beside Diane's plate and let the whole table read it in silence. I thought about doing exactly that for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably 4 or 5 seconds. Here's the question that stopped me, and I want you to really sit with it, because it's the question that changed the shape of the rest of my life, not just that dinner. If proof was the only language this family respected, why was I still volunteering to pay for people who had already decided, long before that night, that I was worth less than my sister? Producing the contract would have won the argument. It would not have won anything else. It would have confirmed, once again, that my worth in this family was something I had to prove with documentation, on demand, in front of an audience every single time. And that once I proved it, everyone would nod, feel briefly embarrassed on my behalf, and go right back to treating Diane like the sun the rest of us orbited, because that was simply easier for everyone, including my mother. I didn't want to win an argument. I wanted to stop playing a game where winning required me to keep paying the entry fee. So I set the spoon down instead, and I said the thing that actually surprised Diane far more than any contract would have. "You're right. I shouldn't eat food I didn't contribute to." I want to be honest about the small, human satisfaction of watching her blink, because she had braced herself for a fight and got an agreement instead. An agreement, delivered flatly enough, can be its own kind of blade. I folded my napkin, I stood up, I put on my coat. And as I walked toward the lobby, past a dozen relatives who had just watched my sister humiliate me and done absolutely nothing but rearrange their napkins, I made a decision that had nothing to do with drama and everything to do with arithmetic. If Diane wanted to be the host of that dinner badly enough to tell a room full of people I hadn't earned the right to eat at it, then I was going to let her have exactly what she'd been performing all night. The full weight of hosting. Every dollar of it. I found Marcus at the reception desk, reviewing service notes on his tablet, and I asked him a question that would end my mother's 60th birthday party as everyone at that table understood it. Has the final charge been processed yet? Not yet, Marcus said. The authorization converts to a charge after dessert is served, per our standard timing. Please remove my card from the folio, I said. He looked up from the tablet, and I watched him do the math a half-second faster than I expected. You understand the room deposit is non-refundable, he said carefully, and that the remaining balance will become due immediately from the party if your authorization is withdrawn. I understand, I said. Please keep the deposit. Consider it the price of learning something. He hesitated, tablet still in hand. Would you like me to tell them there's been a payment issue? Something vague so it doesn't become a scene. I thought about that for a second. I thought about 12 years of things being kept vague so they wouldn't become a scene, and how every single one of those vague, gentle non-scenes had cost me something Diane never had to pay. Tell them the truth, I said. Tell them the woman in the red dress canceled the reservation payment and asked you to hand this to them. I nodded at the folio in his hand. Exactly like that. Don't soften it. Marcus studied my face for a moment, not judging, I think, just recalibrating, the way people do when they realize the quiet woman in front of them is not actually the pushover the room had assumed. Then he nodded once, like a man accepting an assignment he found, in some private way, satisfying to carry out. I walked toward the valet stand. I didn't get far. Claire, my father's voice from the dining room doorway. I turned, and through the glass partition separating the lobby from the private room, I watched Marcus cross to the table and set the black leather folio down beside Diane's plate, calm as a man delivering dessert menus. I watched Diane's smile disappear in real time. I watched my mother lean toward Marcus, confused, saying something I couldn't hear through the glass. I watched Marcus repeat, word for word, exactly what I'd asked him to say. Even from across the lobby, I could see the color drain out of both their faces at once. Diane opened the folio. She scanned the total. She snapped it shut so hard the sound carried through the glass. My father crossed the room toward me, and I want you to notice something about the first words out of his mouth, because I noticed it immediately, and I have never quite let go of it since. Claire, he said, what did you do? Not what did they say to you, not why did you leave the table looking like that. What did you do, as though the only event that had just happened, in a room full of people, was mine? I stopped paying for dinner I was told I hadn't contributed to, I said. He lowered his voice, glancing back at the glass. This is your mother's birthday. It was also my gift, I said. Diane rejected the gift in front of everyone. I'm simply respecting her decision. Behind him, through the glass, I watched Diane stand up so fast her chair nearly toppled, waving the folio like it was on fire. I couldn't hear her yet. I was about to. Because I hadn't left. Not really. I'd only gotten as far as the lobby windows, close enough to watch, close enough to be called back in, and what happened next, once I walked back through those glass doors, was the part of the evening none of them saw coming. I walked back into that dining room not to rescue anyone, but because I wanted Diane to say whatever she was about to say directly to my face, instead of through a pane of glass. This is insane, Diane was saying as I came around the table. She can't just abandon us with this. Marcus remained perfectly composed, the way I imagine he'd learned to over years of standing in rooms exactly like this one. The host removed her payment method before settlement, he said. The outstanding balance is $9,486. Diane stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. I'm the host. Marcus opened his tablet and turned it slightly, not aggressively, just enough that the nearest few people could see the screen if they leaned. The contract, the deposit receipt, the menu approvals, and the card authorization are all in Claire Bennett's name, he said. A murmur moved down the table, quiet at first, the way a draft moves through a room before anyone finds the open window. I heard my cousin whisper to his wife, I thought Diane paid for this. I heard her whisper back, that's what she told us. Diane's head snapped toward them. I coordinated everything. Marcus scrolled once, unhurried. The event file shows a mess. Bennett coordinated the reservation, he said. It also shows several upgrade requests submitted from your email address that were denied because you weren't listed as a financially authorized party on the account. I watched Diane's face go through several colors in under 10 seconds. My mother looked back and forth between Marcus and me like the floor of the room had genuinely tilted under her chair. "Claire, come back inside," she said. "We can discuss this privately." "You were comfortable humiliating me publicly," I said. "Why should the truth require privacy?" That was when my grandfather, Arthur, who had been sitting quietly at the far end of the table all night in the particular way he does, when he's actually paying closer attention than anyone realizes, slowly removed his glasses and set them down beside his plate. I want you to understand something about my grandfather before I tell you what he said next, because his silence that whole evening had been nothing at all like my father's. My father's silence was a man hiding behind a wine label. My grandfather's silence was a man taking inventory. "Before anyone asks Claire for another single thing," Arthur said, in the low, even voice he uses when he actually means to be obeyed, "Diane is going to explain why she collected money from several people at this table for a dinner Claire had already paid for in full." Diane froze. I froze too, half a second behind her, because I had known, clearly, painfully, that my sister was taking credit for a night she hadn't funded. I had not known she'd been taking contributions on top of it. Arthur reached into his jacket pocket and set his phone down on the table, screen up, right next to the folio Marcus had delivered a minute earlier. On it was a text message, sent from Diane's number 4 days before the party. *, send me your share by Friday. I'm covering the party, but every little bit helps. *. Below it, a screenshot of a transfer confirmation. $500 from Arthur to Diane, dated the following morning. My aunt, sitting 3 seats down, went very still and then very quickly checked her own phone. My cousin did the same a beat later. Within maybe 15 seconds, 4 different relatives had pulled up their own transfer histories, and the total on the table, added up out loud, in pieces, by people who were now looking at Diane instead of me, came to just over $2,000. The room had turned. Every single eye that had been on me 30 seconds earlier was now on my sister. Diane looked down at the phones being held up around her like they'd materialized out of nowhere to ambush her personally. "That money was for extras," she said. "Flowers, transportation, tips, things Claire probably forgot." Marcus turned his tablet so the nearest relatives could actually read the itemized contract for themselves. "Transportation was arranged and paid directly by Ms. Bennett," he said. "The floral invoice is included in the total package. Gratuity is also included." My aunt asked, evenly, where her $300 had gone. My cousin asked the same question about his $200, a half-second later, with considerably less patience. Diane's answers started colliding with each other in real time, the way answers do when a person is building an explanation on the spot instead of remembering one. First, she said the money was still sitting in her account, untouched. Then she said she'd spent it on a surprise she hadn't unveiled yet. Then she said everyone had simply misunderstood her original message, as though, "Send me your share. I'm covering the party," were a sentence with some hidden second meaning none of us had the wit to find. Arthur lifted one hand, and remarkably, the whole table actually went quiet for him. "There is nothing unclear about *, send me your share *, he said. "You allowed this family to believe you financed this evening. You insulted the one person who actually did, and you collected money from your own relatives on top of it." Diane turned toward me, panic finally cracking through the arrogance she'd been wearing all night like a second dress. "Claire set this up," she said. "She knew exactly how this would look." I almost admired the speed of it. The way she reached, instantly, for turning my boundary into her conspiracy, as though the only possible explanation for consequences was that someone had engineered them against her. "I didn't know about the transfers," I said. "But I did know you told the hotel you were authorized to add charges you had no intention of paying for. That part, you did entirely on your own." Marcus cleared his throat, and something in the careful way he did it told me he wasn't finished. There's one more matter, he said, and opened an email chain on his tablet. Subject line, birthday presentation revision. He read it out loud, and I watched my mother's face change with every sentence. Diane had contacted the venue's events team that same afternoon, hours before the dinner even started, requesting a new cake plaque that read asterisk with love from Diane and the family asterisk, replacing the message I'd approved weeks earlier, asterisk happy 60th, mom asterisk. She had also asked the photographer to place her beside our mother in every formal photo of the evening, and instructed the event staff not to mention my name during the toast, should anyone ask who had organized the party. The final line of that email, which Marcus reads slowly, in the flat, careful voice of a man reading something he suspects is about to detonate, was this. Asterisk Claire prefers to stay out of the spotlight, asterisk. I felt something inside me go very still and very quiet, in a way that was almost worse than anger. Because up until that exact sentence, some small part of me had been telling myself that Diane had simply, thoughtlessly, accepted praise she hadn't earned. The way you accept a compliment on a haircut you didn't get, out of momentary vanity, without really meaning any harm by it. That email wasn't thoughtless. It was a plan. Diane hadn't stumbled into taking credit for my mother's birthday. She had designed my disappearance from it, in writing, complete with instructions for the staff. My mother read the email twice, her lips moving slightly the second time, the way people read something when they're hoping it will say something different if they just look again. You told me Claire didn't want to be involved, she said to Diane, very quietly. Diane's mouth opened, nothing came out. My mother turned to me. Is that why you didn't give the birthday speech I asked you to write? I hadn't told her that part yet, the part where, 2 weeks earlier, Diane had called to say, Mom actually wants me to do the toast this year. She said you make events too much about yourself. And I had believed her, because why would my own sister lie about something so easy to check? Diane told me you wanted her to do it, I said. She told me you thought I made events too much about myself. My mother's face did something I had genuinely never seen it do before in 28 years. It went from confusion to recognition to something that looked almost like grief. The specific grief of realizing you've been standing on a floor that was never actually solid. My father came back to the table then, no longer able to hide behind the wine bottles label, no longer able to pretend the only crisis in the room was the one he could avoid by studying a font. Diane, he said, and something in his voice surprised the entire table, including me. Pay the bill. The directness of it, 4 words, no hedge, no softening, landed harder than anything Arthur had said all night. Maybe because it was the first time in longer than I could remember that my father had said anything at that table without checking first how it would be received. Diane laughed once, a short, brittle sound with no humor anywhere inside it. With what? I never agreed to $9,000. Neither did the relatives who sent you money under false pretenses, Arthur said, and yet you accepted theirs without hesitation. Diane pulled a credit card from her purse and set it on the table with a small, theatrical flourish, clearly meant to restore some sense of control to the room. Fine, she said. Charge it. Then everyone can stop acting like I committed some unforgivable crime. Marcus took the card to the terminal at the edge of the room. We waited, 12 or so people who, an hour earlier, had been eating an ordinary birthday dinner, now sitting in a silence so complete I could hear the ice settling in the water glasses. The machine beeped. He tried again. He came back and said quietly that the transaction had been declined. Diane's face went from red to something closer to gray. She handed him a second card. That one was declined too. Nobody laughed. I want to be honest with you, for one small, ungenerous second, some cornered part of me wanted to. But the silence that actually followed was worse than laughter would have been, because it stripped away, in real time, in front of everyone who had ever admired her, the entire image Diane had spent years polishing. The successful daughter, the generous organizer, the person who always, somehow, knew better than the rest of us. My mother looked at her, really looked at her, maybe for the first time that night, and for once, she did not rush to smooth it over. You told me you had paid for the venue, she said. You let me thank you in front of everyone. Diane's eyes filled, though her voice stayed sharp, the way people's voices do when they're crying out of frustration rather than remorse. "I was going to make it work," she said. "Claire always has money. She enjoys rescuing everyone." That sentence, more than anything else said that night, finished off whatever sympathy remained in the room for her. I could see it happen, the last few relatives who'd still been giving Diane the benefit of the doubt quietly withdrawing it, the way people do when someone hands them one excuse too many. I stepped back through the glass doors and returned to the edge of the table, not to rescue anyone, but because I wanted Diane to hear the next part clearly, without a pane of glass to soften it for her. "I did enjoy helping," I said. "What I didn't enjoy was being erased while you spent my money as proof of your own generosity." Diane's voice cracked. "You're really going to leave Mom with this bill?" I looked at my mother, who was sitting very still, both hands flat on the table like she needed something solid to hold on to. "No," I said. "Diane's, she claimed the dinner, she accepted the credit, she collected the contributions, and she told me not to eat. Ownership comes with a price." Arthur asked Marcus to separate the charges Diane had personally requested, the wine pairing, the seafood tower, the extra guests, from the original package I'd contracted and paid the deposit on. Marcus explained, evenly, that the party could settle the remaining balance using multiple cards, since no single person seemed prepared to cover the whole thing alone. My father paid a portion. My mother, quietly, pulled from a small savings account she mentioned almost apologetically, as though embarrassed to need it. Several relatives applied their earlier contributions to the balance, but only after Diane transferred the money back to them first, one by one, at the table, while everyone watched the number in her own account fall in real time on her banking app, because at some point someone had asked to see it, and she hadn't had the leverage left to refuse. She had to borrow the final chunk from my father, who told her, in front of everyone, that it would be documented and repaid monthly. Not because he needed the paperwork, because he wanted her to understand that this time there would be a record. The dinner continued only because the kitchen had already prepared most of the courses. But the celebration itself, the thing my mother had actually wanted, the reason any of us were in that room, was over, and everyone at the table seemed to understand that, at the same moment, in the same quiet way you understand a storm has passed even though the sky hasn't fully cleared yet. Nobody asked Diane to give the toast. The photographer quietly set aside the shot list she'd requested. Marcus had the cake plaque replaced before dessert service, the original message, the one I'd chosen weeks earlier, back on the cake where it belonged. * happy 60th, Mom. *. When Marcus offered me a slice, I declined. My grandfather caught my arm gently on my way past his chair. "You didn't do this," he said quietly, just for me. "You only stopped hiding it. There's a difference, and I want you to remember which one it was on the nights when this family tries to tell you otherwise." I nodded because I couldn't quite trust my voice yet, and I noticed my father watching the two of us from across the table, still holding his wine glass, still not quite able to meet my eyes directly. He would find his own words eventually. That night, at least, he found the decency to look ashamed instead of looking away entirely, which was, I told myself walking past him, at least a small improvement over the version of him who'd studied a wine label for most of the evening. I had lost $2,000 that night, a deposit I'll never see again, money I could technically afford to lose, and still felt every single time I thought about it in the weeks that followed. But I had gained something I had spent 28 years trying and failing to buy with generosity, with silence, with quietly funding one occasion after another, and hoping it would eventually add up to being seen. A clean answer. They hadn't failed to recognize what I did for this family because I had explained it poorly, or too rarely, or without enough proof. They had failed to recognize it because my silence had always been convenient for them, and convenience, once established, doesn't correct itself just because you finally speak up once. It corrects itself when speaking up stops being an option you're offering and starts being a fact you've already acted on. As I left the dining room a second time, my mother followed me out into the lobby. "Please," she said, "don't let this destroy the family." I turned to her and asked the question I had been swallowing since I was 16 years old, standing next to a program nobody remembered I'd made. Why is the family only considered destroyed when I stop accepting the damage? She didn't have an answer. I hadn't expected one. I drove home alone that night, past the hotel's lit-up sign, past the restaurant where I'd once celebrated a much smaller version of my own achievements to considerably less applause than Diane got for things she hadn't done at all. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't feel abandoned. I felt finished. I didn't yet know that the messages were already starting to pile up on my phone, or that within a week, my grandfather would be pulling together a folder that would turn one humiliating dinner into a reckoning that reached back 12 years. I didn't know Diane would show up at my office with an envelope and sunglasses, or that a document Marcus would forward me a month later would reveal something about my sister's plans for that night I hadn't even imagined yet. Standing in that lobby, I only knew one thing for certain: driving home in the dark in a coat the color of everything I'd finally stopped swallowing. I was never again going to let anyone tell me I hadn't earned my seat at my own family's table. The messages started before I'd even gotten my key in my own front door. My father wrote first, * your mother is crying. * no question attached to it, no ask, just a fact, dropped in my lap like it was mine to fix. Diane wrote next, * you humiliated me on purpose. * My mother called 6 times in under an hour, and when I didn't pick up, she left a voice message asking me to come back and end the night properly with Diane, as though the two of us had simply had a spat over dessert instead of my sister, publicly accusing me of not earning my own dinner. I listened to that message twice, standing in my kitchen still in my coat, and I want to tell you the wording would have been almost funny if I hadn't been able to hear, underneath it, the accusation it was actually making. They still believed peace was something I was supposed to produce, on demand, by swallowing whatever truth was inconvenient that week. I turned my phone off, but before I did, I called Sophie, because I needed to hear one voice that night that wasn't asking me to fix something. I did it, I told her. I actually did it. I know, she said. I could hear it in your text from an hour ago. How do you feel? I sat with that question longer than I expected to. Lighter, I said finally, and also like I might throw up, both somehow at the same time. That sounds about right, Sophie said. For what it's worth, I've been waiting 4 years to hear you sound like this. Go to sleep, Liv. Whatever's waiting for you in that group chat tomorrow, it can wait for morning coffee first. I slept better that night than I had in months, which surprised me more than almost anything else that happened. In the morning, I turned my phone back on to 37 messages in the family group chat. Diane had posted a long explanation sometime around midnight, the kind of message that uses a great many words to avoid saying any one thing directly. She'd collected contributions, she wrote, only because she'd intended to reimburse everyone later, once the excitement of the evening had settled and she could sit down and calculate what she actually owed. My grandfather replied with a single sentence, * then show us the transfer you're planning to make. *. She didn't answer that. My aunt asked, a few messages down, why Diane had changed the cake plaque without telling anyone. My cousin shared a screenshot, one Diane had apparently sent him weeks earlier, before the dinner even happened, that read * Claire barely helped, so I'm covering almost everything, just wanted you to know in case she tries to take credit later. *. I read that one twice. It meant Diane hadn't just improvised her story at the table under pressure. She'd been telling it in advance, to specific people, as a kind of insurance policy against exactly the moment that eventually happened. My mother, scrolling through all of this in real time, finally wrote, * can we please stop discussing private family matters in this group? *. My grandfather's reply came less than a minute later, and I saved a screenshot of it, because I think it's one of the truest things anyone in my family has ever said out loud. * the deception happened in this group. The correction belongs here too. *. I didn't add anything to the thread. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to. The facts, once they were finally sitting out in the open where everyone could see them, were doing the work I'd spent 12 years trying to do myself, one quiet correction at a time, and never once succeeding. Diane came to my office lobby on Monday morning, without an appointment, wearing sunglasses indoors, which told me she'd rehearsed this on the drive over and hadn't quite committed to the performance by the time she arrived. I met her downstairs rather than let her anywhere near my colleagues, because whatever was about to happen, I didn't want it happening in front of people I had to see every day for the rest of my career. She pushed an envelope toward me before I'd even said hello. Inside was a check for $2,000, the exact amount of my lost deposit. There, she said, now we're even. I handed it back to her. We're not even, I said. Money is the easiest part of this. She took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were tired in a way I hadn't seen on her before, but her anger was fully intact underneath the tiredness, like a pilot light that hadn't gone out even when everything around it had. What else do you want? She said. An audience? A public execution? I want a public correction, I said. I want you to tell the family, in the same place you told them the lie, that I planned and funded that dinner from the first phone call to the last course. I want you to tell them you collected money from multiple people while claiming you were the one paying. I want every contribution returned. I want Dad reimbursed for what he covered Saturday night. And I want you to stop speaking for me, to Mom, to the cousins, to anyone ever again. She stared at me like I'd asked for something genuinely cruel. You want me to destroy my own reputation? No, I said. I want you to stop using mine to protect yours. She lowered her voice, the way she does when she's trying to sound like she's delivering a warning instead of a threat, though with Diane the two have always sounded almost identical. Mom will never forgive you for this. That was the moment I understood, fully, that she hadn't driven across town and put on sunglasses to apologize. She'd come to restore the arrangement we'd always operated under, the one where she offered a small, token gesture. I accepted the blame for whatever conflict resulted from her exposure, and everyone moved on without anything underneath actually changing. I slipped the check back into the envelope and pressed it into her hand. Then let Mom make her own choice, I said. Diane left without another word, and I stood in that lobby for a long moment after the elevator doors closed, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel yet, which was not triumph. It was closer to grief, the specific grief of finally, fully understanding that the sister who'd shared a bedroom with me until I was 12 years old had just tried to buy her way out of a truth for $2,000, and had been genuinely surprised when the number wasn't enough. 2 days later, my mother asked me to come to a family meeting at my parents' house. I agreed, on one condition, that nobody would ask me to apologize for leaving the table on Saturday night. When I arrived, my grandfather was already seated at the kitchen table with a manila folder in front of him, thick enough that it wouldn't quite lie flat. My father sat beside my mother, looking, I thought, about 10 years older than he had a week earlier. Diane took the chair directly across from me, arms crossed, already braced. My mother opened with the speech I'd expected, something about sisters, about misunderstandings, about how one painful night shouldn't be allowed to erase a lifetime of love. I let her finish. Then she said the sentence that told me she still hadn't understood anything. Claire, you could have handled this privately. I tried private for years, I said. Every time Diane took credit for something I did, or changed a story to make herself look better, or insulted me in a room full of people, you told me to let it go. Privacy didn't solve the problem, Mom. It protected it. My father looked down at the table. My mother started to say something in her own defense, and that was when my grandfather opened the folder. Inside were printed copies, the venue emails Marcus had forwarded, the transfer messages the relatives had shown at dinner, and several older group chats I'd forgotten I ever saved. Pulled together, I learned, because Arthur had spent 2 days quietly asking family members to send him examples. One was from my grandparents' anniversary, when I was 16. Another was from my graduation. A third was from a family trip to the mountains 4 years ago, when Diane had told the extended family I'd canceled at the last minute and left everyone to cover my share of the cabin. When in reality, Diane had given me the wrong departure date on purpose, then used my resulting absence as proof to anyone who'd listen that I was unreliable. The pattern filled 23 pages. I watched Diane's face change with every page my grandfather turned. This was no longer one dinner she could explain away as a misunderstanding born of stress. This was a history, laid out in her own words and other people's receipts, 12 years long. This isn't fair, Diane said, when Arthur reached the mountain trip pages. Her voice had lost most of its usual certainty. You're building a case against me like I'm on trial. You're not on trial, Arthur said. If you were, you'd have a lawyer, and we'd be in a courtroom instead of your mother's kitchen. This is a family finally looking at something it's been looking away from for 12 years. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like one to you right now. Why now? Diane asked, and for the first time all evening, I heard something underneath her anger that sounded almost like genuine confusion. Why does one dinner suddenly make all of this matter, when none of it mattered before? It was, I'll admit, a fair question, and I answered it before my grandfather could. Because before, I was the only one asking anyone to look, I said. Nobody in this family was willing to check a single one of these stories against a receipt until a stranger in a hotel lobby did it for us. That's not new information, Diane. That's information nobody wanted enough to go looking for. My father spoke first, quietly. I knew some of this, he admitted. Not the money, but the way you two were treated differently over the years. I stayed quiet because every confrontation felt exhausting, and it was easier to just let it pass. Your silence was a decision, I told him. It just happened to be one that made Diane's life easier and mine harder every single time you made it. He nodded slowly and didn't argue, which from my father was its own kind of admission. It was my grandfather, not me, who brought up the money Diane had actually been struggling with. The thing, I came to understand later, that had made the whole dinner feel so urgently necessary to her in the first place. There's one more page, Arthur said, and I watched Diane's face go from pale to something closer to sick before he'd even turned it around. 2 years earlier, our great-aunt Vivian had died and left a modest trust, split evenly between Diane and me, to be managed jointly with Arthur as trustee until we each turned 30. Mine had sat untouched, growing slowly, exactly the way Aunt Vivian had probably imagined it would. Diane had come to Arthur 18 months earlier, asking to draw against her share early, to open a small boutique clothing store downtown, a business plan she'd shown him with real enthusiasm, real spreadsheets, the kind of ambition that made Arthur, by his own admission, want to say yes. He'd approved a partial early distribution, $12,000. The boutique had closed 8 months later. Diane had never told anyone but Arthur, and Arthur, out of what he now called a mistaken sense of privacy, had never told the rest of the family either, until the folder he was building forced him to look at every quiet thing he'd protected Diane from having to explain. You've been carrying that debt and that failure alone for almost a year, Arthur said to her, not unkindly, but without softening it either. I think that's part of why this dinner mattered so much to you. You needed one thing in front of this family where you looked successful again. Diane didn't deny it. She sat very still, and for the first time all evening, something other than anger moved across her face, something closer to the 16-year-old girl I remembered from before either of us had learned to compete for the same small amount of parental attention. I didn't know how to tell any of you I'd failed at something, she said quietly, so I found a night where I could look like I hadn't. I understood, in that moment, more about my sister than I had in the previous 12 years combined. I want to be honest that understanding her didn't erase what she'd done to me. It just meant I finally knew the shape of the fear driving it, instead of only the damage it left behind. So what happens now? Diane finally asked, looking around the table like she still expected someone to rescue her from the answer. My grandfather answered before I could. You repay what you owe, the dinner, and the remaining balance on the trust distribution on a schedule we'll set together. You correct the lies, publicly, in the same places you told them. And until real trust is rebuilt, you will not manage family money, family reservations, group gifts, or family events of any kind. My mother looked startled by the last part. Diane looked furious. Organizing family occasions had been her throne for as long as I could remember, the one arena where she got to be indisputably, visibly in charge, and losing it clearly hurt her more than the declined credit cards at the table had. My father agreed without hesitation. My mother, after a long silence that told me exactly how much this cost her, agreed too. For how long? Diane asked. A month, a year, just tell me the number and I'll wait it out. It's not a sentence with an end date, Diane, Arthur said. It's a condition that lifts when your behavior earns it, not when a calendar says it's been long enough. If you spend the next year waiting it out instead of actually changing, we'll all be able to tell the difference, and the answer will stay no. That's not fair, Diane said, and I watched her catch herself the instant the words left her mouth, hearing, I think, exactly how it sounded next to 23 pages of receipts. No, my mother said quietly before Arthur could respond. It's not fair, it's earned. Those aren't the same thing, and I think that's actually the lesson underneath all of this, for both of my daughters, and honestly for me too. Diane looked at me, waiting, I think, for me to soften the consequence the way I always had before, to say something generous that would let everyone leave the table feeling like the wound was already closing. I didn't say it. Revenge, I understood sitting at that table, wasn't the moment her credit card had been declined in front of everyone. It was this moment, the moment my family finally stopped asking me to protect Diane from the plain truth of what she'd done, and started asking her to actually answer for it instead. Diane waited 4 days before posting anything in the group chat. Her first attempt wasn't graceful, a paragraph about how emotions had been high and certain assumptions had been made about the party, the kind of language designed to describe a disaster without naming who caused it. My grandfather replied to her privately. She deleted the post within the hour. Her second attempt was shorter, and it was honest, which I hadn't fully expected from her even after everything. Claire planned this dinner, paid the deposit, authorized the reservation, selected the menu, arranged the transportation, and approved the decorations. I let everyone believe I was the host. I collected contributions without telling her, and I used her silence to make myself look generous. What I said to her at the table was cruel and untrue. I am returning the money and repaying what others covered. Asterisk. I read it twice, waiting for the old, automatic urge to jump in and reassure her that it was fine, that we were fine, that the hard part was over now. It never came. I noticed its absence the way you notice a headache finally lifting. The relatives responded with restrained, careful messages. Nobody attacked her, but nobody rushed to erase the consequences either, which I think surprised Diane more than actual anger would have. My aunt asked for her repayment by Friday. My cousin said he needed some space before he was ready to talk to her directly. My father drew up a written schedule for what she owed him and the trust, month by month, with dates. My mother removed Diane from the family event planning account entirely and handed the books over to an outside bookkeeper. Something, she admitted to me quietly, she probably should have done years earlier, for both our sakes. A week after that, my mother came to my apartment alone. She was carrying the blue and silver cake topper, the one Marcus had quietly saved for me after the party ended. She set it on my kitchen counter and said, "I owe you an apology, and I'm not going to ask you to make me feel better about giving it." It was the first genuinely promising sentence she'd said to me in longer than I could remember. She admitted, sitting at my kitchen table, that she had favored Diane for years because Diane demanded attention loudly enough that giving it to her felt urgent, while I had always seemed capable of managing on my own. "You made competence look easy," she said. "I think I treated that as permission to give you less." "Competence isn't the absence of needing something," I told her. "I needed you to defend me. I needed you to ask one question before you believed Diane over me. I needed you not to smile when I was being humiliated at your own birthday dinner." She cried quietly at my kitchen table, and this time I handed her a tissue, but I didn't tell her everything was fine, because it wasn't, not yet, and maybe not for a long while. "I love you," I said. "That doesn't mean we go back to normal. Normal is what hurt me in the first place." We agreed to meet once a week for coffee, and to stop using family gatherings as a shortcut for the kind of repair that actually takes real time. My father called separately a few days later and apologized for treating avoidance as though it were neutrality. I told him the same thing I'd told him in that hotel lobby. Silence chooses a side. It just usually chooses the side that costs it nothing. He started attending counseling with my mother not long after that, which mattered to me more than any speech either of them could have delivered at that kitchen table. Diane didn't contact me again for nearly a month. I assumed, during that silence, that she was simply avoiding me the way people avoid a room where something embarrassing happened to them. I was wrong about that too. What she was actually doing, I'd find out soon enough, was writing something else entirely. Something Marcus would end up forwarding to me almost by accident, and something that would reveal just how far she'd been willing to go that night before a bill exposed everything and stopped her cold. Before any of that, though, my mother came back to my apartment a second time, about 2 weeks after the cake topper conversation, and told me something she said she'd never told anyone in the family, including my father. I had a sister, she said, sitting at my kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug of tea she never actually drank. Older sister, Louise. She died when I was 31, before you were born, so you never knew her, and somewhere along the way, I think I just let the family stop mentioning her, because it was easier than explaining what she was actually like. I had heard the name exactly once before, at a funeral for a great-uncle when I was small, and never again since. I asked my mother why. Because Louise was the one everyone loved first, she said. Not the only one they loved. The first one. The one whose report card got taped to the refrigerator, whose boyfriends got invited to Sunday dinner, whose opinion about where we should go on vacation actually got asked. I was 2 years younger, and I don't know how else to say this, I was the reliable one. The one who didn't need managing, so nobody managed me. Nobody checked on me the way they checked on her, because checking on Louise always felt urgent, and checking on me never did. I sat very still, because I recognized the shape of that sentence in a way that made my chest ache. When she died, my mother went on, I remember standing at her funeral feeling something underneath the grief that I've never said out loud to another living person. Relief. Not that she was gone, I loved her, whatever else is true. Relief that I could finally stop being compared to her, and then feeling so ashamed of that relief that I promised myself I'd never let anyone in my own family feel what I'd felt growing up in her shadow. She looked at me directly, and then I had you and Diane, and I watched Diane need attention the exact same loud, urgent way Louise always had, and I did to you exactly what my own parents did to me. I told myself you were the reliable one. I told myself that meant you needed less. I turned into the parent I swore at that funeral I'd never become, and I didn't even notice I was doing it until a bill landed on a table in front of 30 people. I didn't say anything for a long moment. It would have been easy, in that moment, to simply forgive her on the spot, to tell her the story explained everything, and that explaining it away was the same thing as making it right. I didn't do that, because I'd learned enough in the previous month to know the difference between understanding a pattern and excusing what it cost me. I'm not telling you this so you'll feel sorry for me, my mother said, as though she'd read exactly that hesitation on my face. I'm telling you because I think you deserve to know you didn't imagine any of it, and you didn't misread it, and it didn't come out of nowhere. It came from somewhere very old, and I let it keep going instead of being the one who finally stopped it. That's on me. Not on Louise, not on my own parents, not on anybody but me, because I was the one raising you, when I already knew exactly what it felt like from the other side. Did you ever tell Diane this? I asked. Not yet, she said. I think I owe her the same conversation. I think I owe both of you the whole truth of where this came from, instead of just apologizing for what it did without ever explaining why it happened at all. She did tell Diane, a few weeks later. I know because Diane mentioned it to me herself, briefly, almost shyly, the next time we spoke, as though she were still deciding how much of it she believed applied to her own choices rather than simply excusing them. I don't think either of us fully resolved what to do with that story. But I understood, hearing it, that I hadn't just been fighting a habit Diane and my mother had built between the two of them. I'd been standing at the far end of something that had been quietly moving through this family for 3 generations, waiting for someone to finally name it out loud instead of just living inside it. I haven't told you much about my work during all of this, and I think I should, because the family wasn't the only place where the fallout from that dinner showed up, and it wasn't the only place I had to decide, in real time, whether I was going to keep being quiet to make things easier for other people. I have a friend at the firm named Sophie Harmon, a structural engineer 2 offices down from mine, who I'd eaten lunch with most days for 4 years by the time any of this happened. Sophie had heard enough stories about Diane over the years, secondhand, filtered through my own careful, generous framing of them, to have formed an opinion about my sister long before the birthday dinner ever happened. She's going to do something at that party, Sophie told me, the week before it over sandwiches at our usual table. I don't know what, but you've told me 4 different versions of this exact pattern over 4 years, and every single time, you've ended the story with some version of "but it's fine, I let it go." It's not fine. You just keep deciding it has to be, because the alternative feels like more work than it's worth. I remember being irritated with her for saying it. In the specific way you're irritated with someone for being right about something you've spent years managing to avoid looking at directly. "What am I supposed to do?" I asked her. "Announce at my mother's birthday dinner that I paid for it. That's exactly the kind of thing Diane would do. I don't want to be her." "You don't have to announce anything," Sophie said. "You just have to stop protecting the story where she's the generous one and you're the difficult one for noticing she isn't. Those aren't the same thing, Liv, and I think you've been treating them like they are for longer than you've noticed." I thought about that conversation a great deal in the weeks after the dinner, mostly because of how accurately it had predicted what actually happened, but also because of what came next in my own working life, which I hadn't expected to be connected to any of it. About 3 weeks after the dinner, right around the time the rumor about my supposedly staging the whole confrontation started circulating through my extended family, a slightly different version of it reached my office. Not through Diane directly, I never found out exactly how it traveled, though I have a guess, but through a client relations coordinator who mentioned, carefully, in a hallway conversation clearly meant to be helpful, that some personal drama involving my family had come up in a conversation with one of our newer clients. A couple building a boutique hotel who'd apparently heard, through a mutual acquaintance, that I'd humiliated my own sister at a party over money. I want to be honest about how that landed, because it mattered more than I expected it to. I had spent 3 weeks holding my head up through family gossip I could mostly ignore, because most of the people repeating it didn't have any bearing on my actual life. This was different. This was a version of the story reaching people who decided, every day, whether to trust me with buildings worth millions of dollars. I didn't call Diane about it. I didn't call my mother either. I went to my project director, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Naomi Sinclair, who had promoted me 6 weeks earlier specifically because she trusted my judgment under pressure, and I told her the actual story, plainly, without performing my own innocence for her benefit. The same way I'd eventually learn to tell it to everyone else who needed the truth instead of a softened version of it. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something I've held onto since. "The version of you I've worked with for 2 years planned and executed a $9,000 event flawlessly while your family tried to take credit for it and then stiffed you for the bill. That's not a scandal, Claire. That's a reference." The client meeting happened as scheduled. Nobody mentioned the rumor again, at least not where I could hear it, and the project moved forward without incident. But I've thought about that hallway conversation often since, because it taught me something the family drama alone hadn't quite managed to teach me yet, that the cost of staying quiet doesn't stop at the edge of your own family. It follows you into rooms you worked hard to earn a seat at, and it keeps charging you rent there too, for exactly as long as you let it. Sophie took me out for a drink the week after that and raised her glass before I'd even sat down. "To not being the difficult one," she said, "for noticing what was actually happening the whole time." I clinked my glass against hers, and for the first time since the dinner, I let myself laugh about it. Not because any of it had become funny, but because I finally had someone in my corner who'd seen the whole pattern coming and hadn't needed a single receipt to believe me. Before any of that, though, Diane tried one more thing, and I think it's important I tell you about it, because it's the part of this story that finally convinced my mother, not me, my mother, that this wasn't going to fix itself with time and good intentions alone. About 3 weeks after the dinner, my cousin's wife called me, sounding uncomfortable in the specific way people sound when they've been asked to carry a message they don't fully believe. "I probably shouldn't say anything," she said, which is a sentence that has never once in the history of families been followed by someone actually staying quiet. "But Diane has been telling people a version of what happened where you'd been planning to embarrass her for weeks. That you set the whole thing up on purpose. The card cancellation, Marcus bringing the folio to the table in front of everyone, because you'd been jealous of her for years and finally saw your chance." I sat with that for a moment, not because it surprised me exactly, but because of how tired it made me feel the particular exhaustion of watching someone reach for the same broken tool over and over, expecting it to finally work. "Do you believe that?" I asked her. "No," she said quickly. "Honestly, no. I've seen the group chat. I've seen the receipts Arthur put together. I just thought you should know it's still out there because a couple of the older aunts seem to be listening to it." One of those aunts, my great Aunt Frances, called me herself 2 days later, and I want to tell you about that call because it's the only time in this entire ordeal that a family member confronted me directly with something untrue, to my face, expecting me to simply absorb it the way I always used to. "I heard you'd been planning to humiliate your sister for weeks," she said, without any preamble at all. "I have to say, Claire, that doesn't sound like the girl I've known your whole life." "It isn't," I said. "I canceled a card because my sister told a room full of people I hadn't earned the right to eat dinner. Everything that happened after that was other people looking at receipts that were already true. I didn't plan any of it beyond that one decision." "Well, Diane says." "I know what Diane says," I said calmly, because I found, to my own surprise, that I wasn't angry anymore. Just tired in the specific way you get tired of repeating the same true sentence to people who'd rather believe a more comfortable one. "I'm not going to argue with you about which version you choose to believe, Aunt Frances, but I'd ask you to consider why the version where I'm the villain requires you to ignore 23 pages of documented history, and the version where I'm not requires you to believe exactly what you already know about me from 30 years of actually knowing me." She didn't have an answer for that. She also didn't apologize, not that day, though she did send me a Christmas card that year with a longer note inside it than she'd ever written before, which I took, in the absence of anything more direct, as the closest thing to an apology she was capable of giving. I thanked my cousin's wife, and I didn't call Diane. I'd learned enough in the previous 3 weeks to know that confronting her directly about a whispered story would only give her another stage to defend herself on, another opportunity to reframe my calm as coldness and her manipulation as heartbreak. Instead, I called my mother. "I heard something," I said, "and I want you to hear it from me instead of secondhand, because I think you deserve better information than that even if I'm the one giving it to you." I told her exactly what my cousin's wife had said. My mother went quiet for a long moment on the phone. She told me the same thing. She finally admitted, a few days ago, that you'd been planning your exit for weeks, that the whole thing with Marcus was staged for maximum humiliation. "And what did you say?" I told her I didn't think that sounded like you, my mother said. "But Claire, I want to be honest, some small part of me wanted to believe her, because it would have meant this was a plan I could understand, instead of a pattern I'd apparently been ignoring for 12 years. I appreciated that honesty more than I expected to. It would have been easy for my mother to simply reassure me and leave it there. Instead, she told me the uncomfortable truth about her own doubt, which felt, for the first time in a long while, like something closer to real trust between us. I didn't plan anything beyond canceling my own card, I told her. Everything after that was just people finally looking at what was already true. "I know that now," she said. "It took me longer than it should have. I think that's the part I'm actually apologizing for, not just believing Diane over you at the dinner, but being ready to believe her again 3 weeks later, just because the alternative meant admitting how long I'd let this go." That conversation, more than the cake topper on my counter, was the moment I started to believe my mother might actually be capable of the kind of change she kept promising. Not because she'd stopped doubting me entirely. I don't think that kind of instant transformation is realistic, and I'd have been suspicious of it if she'd claimed it, but because she'd finally started noticing her own doubt out loud, instead of acting on it quietly and leaving me to discover the damage later. My grandfather asked me to lunch alone, a few days after that phone call, at a small diner near his house that he's been going to since before I was born. He ordered the same thing he always orders, a grilled cheese and a cup of coffee he barely touches. And he waited until the waitress had come and gone before he said what he'd actually invited me there to say. "I want to tell you something about your great-aunt Vivian," he said, "and about why I handled her trust the way I did, because I think you deserve to understand the whole shape of it, not just the part that came out at the kitchen table." I hadn't known my great-aunt well. She died when I was in college. A quiet, sharp-eyed woman who sent birthday cards with actual handwritten notes inside them long after everyone else in the family had switched to texting. Vivian had a sister, Arthur said. Your great-great-aunt, technically, though nobody in the family talks about her much anymore. Her name was Agnes. Agnes was, by every account I ever heard, the more impressive of the two, prettier, more charming, better at making people feel important in a room. Vivian spent most of her life quietly managing things behind the scenes so Agnes could shine in front of them. Sound familiar? It did, uncomfortably. When their mother died, Arthur went on, she left the family business jointly to both of them, but everyone simply assumed Agnes would run it because Agnes was the one people noticed. Vivian let her. For 30 years, Vivian did the actual books, actual hiring, actual decisions, while Agnes gave the toasts and shook the hands and got her photograph in the paper twice for it. Vivian never corrected the record, not once that I ever heard of. Why not? My grandfather turned his coffee cup a quarter turn on its saucer. The way he does when he's about to say something he's spent a long time deciding how to phrase. Because she was afraid that if she spoke up, the family would call her petty, or jealous, or difficult, instead of simply correct. He said. She told me once, years before she died, that she'd made peace with being unseen because she thought being seen would cost her more than it was worth. I didn't understand what she meant until I watched the two of you grow up doing something uncomfortably similar. I sat with that for a long moment, the diner's ordinary lunchtime noise going on around us, someone's order being called, a bell over the door. Is that why you split the trust the way you did? I asked, evenly with you as trustee. I told myself it was fairness, Arthur said. Looking back, I think part of it was guilt. I watched what happened to Vivian, and I told myself I'd never let it happen again in this family, and then I turned around and watched you grow up carrying nearly the same weight, and I let it happen anyway, because it's always easier to see a pattern in someone else's life than to catch it moving through your own. You approved Diane's early distribution, I said, even after everything you'd already watched happen between us. I did, he said, and to his credit, he didn't try to soften it. I told myself I was finally giving her a real chance to build something of her own, something nobody could hand her, something she'd have to earn. I didn't ask hard enough questions about why she needed $12,000 in a hurry, or why she never once mentioned it failing. I think I wanted to believe the story where she finally became self-sufficient, because it would have meant I hadn't spent 30 years watching this pattern happen twice in one family and doing nothing meaningful to stop it either time. I didn't say anything for a moment. It was strange, hearing my grandfather, a man I'd always thought of as the one clear-eyed adult in this family, admit that he'd been navigating the exact same blind spot as everyone else, just from a slightly better vantage point. I'm restructuring how the trust operates, he said. Not punitively, practically. From now on, any distribution to either of you requires both of your signatures and a written plan reviewed by an actual financial advisor, not just my say-so over a kitchen table. I should have built that in from the beginning. I built it around trust instead, and trust, it turns out, isn't a system, it's a hope. And if Diane refuses to sign off on something for me out of spite, then the advisor arbitrates, not her, and not you, Arthur said. I'm not interested in giving either of you a lever to hold over the other. I'm interested in making sure nobody in this family ever again has to sit at a table wondering whether the people who love them will bother to check a fact before believing the more charming version of events. I thought about Vivian, 30 years of quiet bookkeeping behind a sister who got her photograph in the paper, and I thought about myself, 12 years of quietly funding things I never got credit for, and I understood, in a way I hadn't fully let myself before, that I hadn't just been fighting my sister that whole time. I'd been fighting a shape the family kept pouring itself into, generation after generation, whenever nobody stopped to ask why. Thank you for telling me about her, I said. I should have told you years ago, Arthur said. I think I was protecting the family's story about itself instead of protecting you. That's its own kind of Diane, isn't it? Everybody in this family's had a version of that instinct, one way or another. It's long past time we all stopped. Diane didn't contact me for nearly a month after the rumor came apart in her hands. During that silence, I received an email from Marcus at the hotel, subject line, *thought you should have this. *. Attached was a document he'd found while closing out the event file for our records. A proposed toast Diane had submitted to the venue's events coordinator 2 days before the party, to be printed on a small card and handed to whoever the MC ended up being, in case Diane wanted a backup in hand rather than speaking entirely off the cuff. I want to read you the part that mattered most, because I've read it enough times myself that I can recite it without looking. Asterisk, I want to thank my mother for teaching me that the people who truly contribute never need recognition for it. Tonight is proof of that. Some of us show up in the ways that count, even when it isn't easy, even when others get too busy with their careers to remember what family actually means. I'm proud to have personally made sure this celebration happened the way Mom deserved. Asterisk. It was scheduled, according to Marcus's notes, to be delivered between the main course and dessert. Timed, deliberately, for the moment the room would be warmest, most full, most primed to applaud. The cruelty of it wasn't accidental or in the moment. It was polished, rehearsed, written down and submitted for approval days in advance, the same way you'd submit a wedding toast or a eulogy, treated with the same care, aimed at the same target. I forwarded the document to my grandfather, my mother, and my father with no commentary of my own. I didn't need to add anything. The document spoke for itself in a way 12 years of my own explanations never quite had. I didn't hear the phone call my mother made to Diane that evening, but I learned about it a few days later from my mother herself, who repeated most of it to me almost word for word, sitting at my kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug she never drank from. I asked her one question, my mother told me. I asked her if that toast had been read out loud that night, in front of everyone, in front of your grandfather, would she have felt proud standing up there saying it? She didn't answer for almost a full minute. Then she said, I don't know anymore what I would have felt. And Claire, that was almost worse than if she'd said yes. It meant some part of her already knew exactly how cruel it was and submitted it anyway, and was only now, with it sitting in front of her in writing, finally letting herself see it. She had canceled a weekend trip the two of them had already planned together, and told Diane, plainly, that they would not resume their usual closeness until Diane addressed the pattern honestly. Not the dinner alone, but the whole shape of it going back years. That was the loss, I think, that finally reached Diane in a way none of the money or the declined cards had. She had spent her entire life as the protected daughter, the one whose motives were automatically assumed to be good, the one who got the benefit of every doubt before anyone even thought to look for one. Losing that, not losing me, not losing the family's money, but losing the automatic trust itself, was the first consequence I watched actually land on her the way I think consequences are supposed to land. Not as punishment, as information she could no longer avoid. When Diane finally asked to meet, about 5 weeks after the dinner, we chose a public cafe 2 blocks from my office, the kind of place with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu, neutral ground for both of us. She arrived without an envelope this time, no excuse prepared in advance as far as I could tell, no sunglasses. I read the toast again, she said, before she'd even sat down fully. The one Marcus found, I don't recognize the person who wrote it. I do, I said. I've known her for years. She winced, but she didn't argue with me, which was new. She told me in pieces, over coffee neither of us finished, about the boutique. Not just the number Arthur had already shared with the family, but what it had actually felt like, watching something she'd poured a year of her life and Aunt Vivian's money into fail in front of everyone who'd initially been so excited for her. She told me my promotion had landed in the middle of that failure, like a spotlight aimed at the exact spot she didn't want anyone looking. I thought if everyone saw you as selfish, she said, I'd still look valuable by comparison. It's an ugly thing to say out loud. It's uglier that I actually thought it. Are you sorry you hurt me? I asked her, or sorry the plan failed? She took a long time to answer that, longer than I expected. Both, she finally said. I wish I could tell you it was only the first one. It wasn't, not completely, not yet maybe. It wasn't the answer I would have written for her if I'd been scripting the moment in advance. But it was honest, in a way almost nothing she'd said to me in the previous month had managed to be, and I found I trusted the honest, unflattering answer far more than I would have trusted a clean, tearful one. I'm not ready to forgive you, I told her. I might not ever be ready to trust you again with money, or with my reputation, or with the story of what happened between us. I need you to understand that going in, so you're not building towards some finish line that isn't actually there. She nodded. What can I do then, if there's no finish line? Change when nobody's watching, I said. Stop expecting access to me as proof that the change is real. Those are two different things, and you've spent your whole life treating them like the same one. She was quiet for a moment, turning her coffee cup slowly on its saucer. A habit I realized, watching her do it, that she'd probably picked up from Arthur without either of them noticing. My therapist asked me something a few weeks ago that I haven't been able to shake, she said. She asked me to name one time in my adult life I'd made myself smaller so someone else could be comfortable. I sat there for 10 full minutes and couldn't think of a single example. Then she asked me to name one time I'd made you smaller so I could be comfortable, and I couldn't stop talking for the rest of the session. She looked up at me. I don't expect that to mean anything to you yet. I just needed to say it to someone besides her. I didn't tell her it meant nothing. It didn't mean everything either, not that day, not sitting across a chipped table with coffee going cold between us. But I noticed it, the way you notice weather changing before you're willing to call it a different season yet, and I let myself hold it as exactly that much and no more. There's something else, she said. I called Carla, the client relations coordinator at your firm, the one who apparently mentioned some personal drama to a client a few months back. I found out it traced back to something I'd said carelessly at a wedding shower. I called her and corrected it directly. I didn't tell you because I didn't want it to look like I was trying to earn anything back with it. I just didn't want you carrying a cost I'd caused without at least knowing. I'd gone back and tried to fix the specific damage. That, more than the therapy line, was the detail that actually landed. Not because it undid anything. The rumor had already run its course by then. Naomi Sinclair's reference not scandal line had already carried me through it. But because it was the first thing Diane had done for me since the dinner that she hadn't announced, hadn't used as leverage, hadn't needed me to witness in order for it to count. We left the cafe separately. There was no hug, no swelling music, no instant sense of healing settling over either of us. If anything, that absence, the plain, unresolved quality of the moment, made it feel more real to me than any of the reconciliations I'd half expected walking in. Real repair, I was starting to understand, doesn't announce itself with relief. It just quietly stops making things worse, one ordinary conversation at a time, and asks you to notice that on your own. I want to tell you about my Aunt Helen, my mother's older cousin rather than a true aunt, though we'd always used the title anyway, because she's the reason the last 6 months didn't cost me more than they already had. Helen had been at the birthday dinner. She was one of the relatives who'd sent Diane money, $300, transferred back to her at the table while everyone watched the number in Diane's account fall. And I'd assumed, in the weeks after, that the whole episode would simply embarrass her into keeping her distance from the entire mess. The way embarrassment makes people quietly disappear from situations that remind them of their own bad judgment. Instead, she called me directly, about a month after the dinner, and asked if she could take me to lunch. I run the vendor committee for our county's Historical Preservation Society, she told me, over a shared appetizer at a restaurant near my office. We're renovating 3 buildings downtown next year, real budget, real timeline, the kind of project that needs someone who actually knows what they're doing instead of someone who's simply good at sounding like they do. She looked at me directly. I watched you handle that dinner from start to finish, Claire. The planning, the vendor management, the way you kept your composure when your own sister tried to publicly dismantle you in front of 30 people. I don't need someone who's never had a hard project. I need someone who's already proven she doesn't fall apart when one goes sideways. It wasn't charity, and I want to be clear about that, because I've turned down offers before that were dressed up as opportunities and were really just pity with better lighting. Helen hired my firm on its merits. Through a formal proposal process, I had to win against 2 competing bids. But she told me honestly that the dinner was the reason she'd thought to call me in the first place, instead of simply going with whichever firm her committee had used the last time. Word travels strangely in families, she said. Your sister spent years making sure everyone heard about her generosity. What people actually remember 6 months later isn't the toast. It's who kept their composure when the real test showed up unannounced. That project became, within the year, the largest single contract of my career, and I think about Helen's phone call often, not because it undid anything Diane had done, but because it proved something I hadn't fully let myself believe yet at that point. That the story circulating about that dinner wasn't only the humiliating one Diane had tried to write, or the messy one my extended family had whispered about at the Sunday table. There was another version moving through the same rooms, quieter, slower, and it was actually true, and it was actually about me. I told Sophie about the contract the same night I signed it, over the drink we'd started making a standing weekly appointment. She didn't look surprised. "I told you," she said, "reference, not scandal." 6 months after that dinner, my mother invited me to a small family gathering at the same hotel. My first instinct was to refuse. I sat with that instinct for about a day, turning it over, before my mother sent a follow-up text that changed my mind. Not an argument, not a plea, just 3 attachments. The reservation confirmation, the paid receipt in full under her own name, and a guest list with no surprises on it. Asterisk, you don't need to organize anything, asterisk, her message said. Asterisk, you only need to decide whether you want to come. Asterisk. That distinction mattered more than I think she realized when she wrote it. For the first time in longer than I could remember, an invitation to a family event didn't come with an invisible expectation attached to it, that I'd quietly manage some piece of it, fund some piece of it, smooth over some piece of it, all while being told later that I'd made it too much about myself for noticing I'd done any of that at all. I accepted. When I arrived, Diane was already seated, and I noticed, almost immediately, everything she hadn't touched. The place cards, the menu, the photographer's schedule, because there was no photographer this time, no shot list, no plan for anyone's face to end up more prominently displayed than anyone else's. The dinner was simple, fully paid. Intentionally, deliberately ordinary, the exact opposite of the production Diane had once built out of my quiet generosity. My mother had arranged it herself, with my father's help, and I could tell, watching them move through the small, unremarkable logistics of an actual evening together, that something between them had shifted too, in ways that had nothing directly to do with me or Diane. My grandfather sat at the head of the table, watching everyone with the faint, contained smile of a man who understood that real progress is almost always less impressive to watch than a good performance, and far more valuable to actually live inside. Diane greeted me politely when I sat down. No dramatic apology, no speech prepared for the occasion. Over the previous months, I'd learned through my mother, never through Diane herself, using her own progress as leverage, which I noticed and appreciated, that she'd repaid every relative in full, completed 3 of her scheduled payments toward the trust and the deposit, stopped managing any family event entirely, and started seeing a therapist twice a month. That last detail mattered to me more than any of the money. Diane mentioning her own therapy to bargain for my forgiveness would have told me nothing had really changed. My mother mentioning it in passing, without any request attached, told me something actually had. My aunt found me before we sat down, the same aunt who'd sent Diane $300 and asked for it back at the table 6 months earlier. She hugged me longer than she needed to. I should have said something that night, she told me quietly. Before Marcus ever walked in with that folio, I noticed things weren't adding up for months before that dinner, and I told myself it wasn't my place to say anything. I'm sorry it took a stranger doing my job for me. You're saying it now? I told her, and I meant it as something closer to forgiveness than I expected to feel, standing in that same lobby where nobody had followed me out 6 months earlier. It didn't erase that nobody had followed me. It just meant something different was possible going forward, and I found I was willing to let that be enough. My cousin, the one who'd whispered, "That's what she told us at the original dinner," caught my eye across the room and gave me a small, sheepish nod that I understood as its own kind of apology, delivered the only way some people know how to deliver one, without words, hoping you'll read the intention correctly and not require them to say it out loud. I read it correctly. I let it stand. Partway through the main course, a serving dish was set down on the table between Diane and me. For one suspended second, I felt the whole weight of the last 6 months settle into that single ordinary object. The same kind of dish, the same position between us, the same silence spreading out around the table while everyone waited to see what would happen next. I remembered her finger tapping a spoon just like it. I remembered the sentence that had started all of this. Diane remembered too. I could see it on her face, the same half-second of recognition passing across it that was passing across mine. She picked up the serving spoon, and instead of tapping it, instead of saying anything about who had or hadn't earned the right to use it, she simply held the dish out toward me. "You first," she said. It was a small gesture. I want to be honest that I didn't mistake it for a full transformation, and I don't think Diane intended it as one either. It was one dish, one dinner, one instant of ordinary courtesy that would have meant nothing at all if it had come from anyone else at that table. But it came from her, in the exact spot where the opposite gesture had once cost me so much, and I accepted it for exactly what it was. A start, nothing more, and for the first time in a long time between us, nothing less either. I filled my plate without apology. Earlier that evening, before the toast, I'd watched my father lean over and say something to Diane I wasn't meant to hear, though the room was small enough that I caught most of it anyway. "I should have told you no a long time before that dinner ever happened," he told her. "Not about the money, about all of it, letting you believe being impressive mattered more than being honest. I let that happen because it was easier than telling you the truth when you were small enough that it still would have mattered less to hear it." Diane hadn't answered him. She just reached over and squeezed his hand once, the way Arthur had squeezed mine in that same room 6 months earlier, and I understood, watching it, that my father had finally started doing for Diane what none of us had done enough of for either of his daughters at the right time: telling the truth before it cost something enormous to say it. Later, after the plates had been cleared, my mother stood to make a toast. She thanked my father for helping her arrange the dinner, my grandfather for insisting on honesty, even when it cost the family its comfortable version of itself, and Diane for beginning to take real responsibility. Then she turned and looked directly at me, and something in the room went quiet in a way that felt different from the silence at the last dinner, not a silence waiting to see how I'd absorb something, but one making space for what she was about to say. "I used to praise Claire for being strong," my mother said, when what I actually meant was that I'd come to expect her to survive without much support from the rest of us. I was wrong to let that become the family's excuse. Her generosity was never an obligation any of us were owed, and her boundaries were never a punishment, no matter how many times we treated them like one. Nobody said anything after that. My mother didn't ask me to respond, and I understood that restraint as its own kind of apology. The willingness, finally, to let a hard truth sit in a room without immediately rushing to soften it or explain it away. She simply raised her glass, and after a moment, so did everyone else at the table. After dinner, Diane found me near the lobby windows, in almost the exact spot where I'd stood with a folio-carrying man 6 months earlier, watching my family's faces change through the glass. "I know we're not fixed," she said. "I also know I spent years making you smaller because I was afraid of feeling small myself. Understanding that doesn't undo it. I know that too." "I know," I told her. "I'm not asking you to undo it. I don't think that's actually possible for either of us." "I'm going to keep doing the work anyway," she said, "even without a finish line, even if it takes longer than either of us wants." I believed she meant it, standing there in that lobby. I also knew that believing her didn't require me to trust her yet, and that those two things, belief and trust, were finally allowed to sit at different distances from me, instead of collapsing into one more time just because it would have been easier for everyone else at the table. We walked back separately. It felt, for the first time in this entire story, like exactly the right amount of distance to be walking at. The family never went back to the old version of normal, and I've come to understand that as the actual victory, not a consolation prize sitting next to a bigger one we somehow missed. Diane is no longer treated as the automatic leader the moment a family occasion needs planning. My father no longer disappears behind a wine bottles label when a conversation turns uncomfortable. My mother checks facts now before she defends anyone, including me, which is its own strange, welcome kind of fairness. I stopped funding celebrations to earn affection I should have simply been given. I stopped laughing at jokes that were really insults wearing a costume. I stopped explaining my own boundaries to people who had already decided, long before I opened my mouth, to misunderstand them on purpose. Some relatives have called me colder since that night. My grandfather calls me clearer, and I've decided, after thinking about it for the better part of a year, that he's the one who's right. Clarity never once made me cruel. It only ended a very old family tradition of treating my pain as the reasonable price for everyone else's comfort. The downtown project I'd been promoted to lead the same month all of this started finished construction a little over a year later, on schedule and under budget, and Helen's historical preservation contract broke ground not long after that, on a much larger site than either of us had originally scoped. I stood at the ribbon cutting for the first project in a coat that wasn't red navy that day, because I'd finally stopped needing to be easy to spot from across a room, and I thought, watching people I'd never met admire something I'd actually built, that this was the version of being seen I'd been chasing my whole life without knowing what it was supposed to look like. Not a toast. Not a compliment relayed secondhand through someone else's mouth. Just a thing standing where I said it would stand, holding the weight I designed it to hold, whether or not anyone in the room knew my name. I ran into Marcus once more, about 8 months after that dinner, at a restaurant opening downtown that his hotel group was catering. He recognized me before I recognized him, and he crossed the room just to shake my hand. "I think about that folio more than I probably should," he told me. "In this job, you deliver a lot of bad news to a lot of people over the years. Cancellations, overcharges, families falling apart over seating charts. Most of them fall apart right there in front of you and never put themselves back together in any way I get to see. You're the only one I ever watched walk back through those doors and actually change the outcome instead of just surviving it." I told him I hadn't done it alone, that a grandfather with a folder and a friend who kept asking me the obvious follow-up question had done at least as much of the work as I had. He said that was probably true of most outcomes worth having, and that he still hoped, whenever a difficult table called his desk, that whoever was standing in the lobby that night had people like that waiting for them too. Sophie still asks me the follow-up question these days whenever I start telling a story a certain practiced way, the way that makes something painful sound smaller than it actually was for the comfort of whoever's listening. I've gotten better at catching myself before she has to ask it out loud. Not perfect. Better. The night Diane told me I shouldn't eat because I hadn't contributed a penny, she expected me to defend the cost of my own plate, the way I always had before, the way that had always been easiest for everyone but me. Instead, I stopped paying for the entire illusion sitting on top of it. The bill exposed her lies. That part was almost incidental, in the end. The real consequence was bigger and slower and far more permanent than a declined credit card at a family dinner. She lost the automatic protection that had let those lies grow, unquestioned, for 12 years, in a family that had always found it easier to believe the more charming version of events than to check. I didn't get my revenge by ruining my sister's life. I got it by finally refusing to keep building mine on top of my own silence. The cake topper still sits on a shelf in my apartment, blue and silver, a little worn now at one corner where I've picked it up more times than I probably should admit. My mother and I still have coffee most weeks, and most weeks now, at least one of those conversations is about something that has nothing to do with any of this at all: her garden, a book she's reading, a recipe she wants my opinion on, which is its own quiet, unremarkable miracle I try not to take for granted. Diane still calls sometimes, still doing the work as far as I can tell, though I've stopped keeping score of it the way I once kept score of everything else between us. Some debts, I've learned, aren't meant to be settled all at once. They're meant to be paid down slowly, in a currency neither of you fully agreed on in advance, for exactly as long as it takes to matter. Forgiveness, if it ever fully arrives, is going to be earned slowly, in ordinary, unremarkable moments like a shared serving dish at a family dinner, not handed over all at once because someone finally said the right apology out loud. Respect came first, and it came without asking my permission, the way real things tend to. And every time I remember walking out of that dining room in my red coat, I no longer think about the $2,000 I lost that night. I think about the part of myself I finally stopped giving away for free. If you stayed with me all the way to the end of this one, I have to imagine some part of it stayed with you too. If it did, subscribe to Revenge Lab. We tell these stories every week for anyone who was ever told to make themselves smaller, and finally decided that dinner was over.